Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're going to talk about why mature mule deer feel invisible and why the biggest bucks in the country can be living right in front of hunters who never know they're there. Because here's the truth: mature mule deer are not ghosts, they are not magical animals that disappear from the mountain, but they are just extremely good at using terrain, timing, pressure, cover, wind, and human behavior, all to avoid exposure. Though most mule deer hunters look at a basin, a ridge system, or a piece of broken country and ask, where are the deer? But mature bucks force you to ask a better question: where can a buck live here without being seen? That's a very different way to look at the landscape. Now, if you're not familiar with who I am, I've been hunting and guiding Western big game for over 34 years, and I've been a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach for more than 30 years, and I'm here to help you become a more successful and consistent mule deer hunter. So in this episode, we're going to break down why mature mule deer feel invisible, how they use the country differently, and how to start seeing the details a lot of mule deer hunters miss. Because most mule deer hunters step into mule deer country looking for deer activity. They look for open basins, obvious feed, visible trails, glassable slopes, and places where deer should be easy to see. And there's nothing wrong with that as a starting point. But the problem is that general deer habitat and mature buck habitat are not always the same thing. Basin can hold does, young bucks, fresh sign, and good feed, and still not be the place where a mature buck spends his daylight hours. Mature bucks are not just looking for food, they're looking for security. They want terrain that gives them escape cover, wind advantage, broken visibility, difficult approach routes, and multiple ways out if pressure shows up. That's why a mature buck can live in the same drainage, the same ridge system, or even the same mountain face as the deer you're seeing, but still feel completely absent. He's not necessarily miles away, he's often offset. He's in the brushy finger beside the open feed. He's on the broken bench below the visible slope. He's using the same country from a more secure layer. He's smarter, he's wiser, he's got more years under his belt, more times being spooked or shot at, right? The mistake is assuming the best looking mule deer country is the same thing as mature buck country. Now, mature mule deer don't always need heavy timbered hide either. A lot of times they only need terrain that breaks the hunter's eyes. That's one of the biggest reasons hunters can glass a basin for hours, see does, see young bucks, maybe see deer feeding in the open, and still miss the mature buck that's living right there. He might be tucked into a folded side hill where the slope rolls just enough to hide his body. He might be bedded on a broken bench where the brush, the rocks, and the shadows all blend together. He might be using a finger ridge, a small cut, a timbered pocket, or a brush patch near open feed that only exposes him when he stands, stretches, or shifts position. That buck does not have to disappear into a giant forest. Sometimes one little wrinkle in the country is just enough. One roll below the skyline, one shadow under a rock face, that happens a lot. One patch of brush that hides his outline, one short movement lane that only gives you a few seconds to catch him. Does and young bucks often live in the obvious parts of the same basin, but mature bucks tend to use the edge of it. A mature buck can be in open country and still be hidden if the terrain breaks up your angle of viewing him. Mature bucks aren't always nocturnal in the simple way a lot of hunters like to explain it either. A lot of times they're not completely inactive during daylight. They're just very selective about when they expose themselves. That window might be the last few minutes before dark. It might be the first few minutes after legal light. It might be a short midday reposition inside security cover when the wind changes or shade shifts or pressure pushes him. It might happen ahead of a storm front, after hunters leave a ridge, or during a small feeding movement close to bedding cover. That's why mature mule deer bucks can feel invisible. Most hunters glass when the glassing is comfortable. They glass the obvious time, the obvious slope, and the obvious opening. But mature mule deer bucks often move when conditions force them to, not when it's convenient for the deer hunter. A buck might only show himself for 30 seconds in a place you watched for 3 hours. And if that 30 seconds happens while you're changing spots, looking at your phone, digging through your pack, eating a snack, or mentally checking out, the buck stays invisible. I'm not saying that you can't do any of those things. I'm just telling you how short that window can be. Sometimes the buck's not invisible, your attention was just not sharp during the only time he gave you.
Hey, if you're serious about becoming a more consistent mule deer hunter, I built a mule deer hunting series of ebooks to walk you through my entire process step by step. This is a 7-volume system designed specifically for Western hunters pursuing mule deer in real mountain and public land environments. In Volume 1, Foundations and Reality, you're going to learn how to understand how mule deer actually live, the myths that mislead most hunters, and the mindset required for consistent success. In Volume 2, Finding Mule Deer and Understanding Pressure, you're going to learn how mule deer move across the landscape and how hunting pressure changes their behavior. In Volume 3, Terrain, Aspect, and Positioning, you're going to learn how to read mule deer country and position yourself correctly using terrain and wind. In Volume 4, Glassing, Visual Discipline, and Buck Identification, you're going to learn how to find mule deer, glass efficiently, and identify mature bucks. In Volume 5, Early Season and High Country Strategy, you're going to learn how to hunt velvet and early season bucks in alpine terrain. In Volume 6, Rut, Transition, and Late Season Movement, we're going to talk about understanding migration, cold weather movement, and how bucks shift through the season. And in Volume 7, Execution and Decision Stacking, we're going to talk about how to close the distance, execute under pressure, and make disciplined decisions during the stalk. If you want to hunt mule deer with structure instead of guesswork, you can buy them individually, or you can bundle all the volumes together and save 50% off the entire mule deer hunting series of ebooks at backboneunlimited.com.
Another point I want to highlight is that hunting pressure does not always push a mature mule deer 10 miles into some untouched wilderness pocket either. Sometimes it does, but a lot of times pressure just changes how he uses the same country he was already living in. That's where hunters get fooled a lot of times, including myself. A buck might still be in the same drainage, the same basin, or the same ridge system, but now he tightens up. He beds earlier. He rises later. He reroutes around exposed openings. He shifts away from roads, two tracks, trailheads, and predictable human access. He might use steeper country or thicker pockets or rougher approaches or even bedding areas where there's only one or two realistic ways for danger to actually reach him. Now, research has shown that male mule deer during hunting season select security habitat away from motorized routes, and that matches what serious mule deer hunters see in the field. Mature bucks don't have to leave the deer country, they just start using the safer pieces of it or the safest pieces of it. The does and younger bucks, they might still be visible, sure. They might still feed in the obvious openings, but the mature bucks might be feeding later, moving shorter, and bedding in a place that gives him the advantage. Pressure doesn't make mature bucks disappear. Pressure separates visible deer from killable mature bucks. There's a difference there. Mature bucks survive by knowing their country, right? They're not just wandering around hoping to find safety. By the time a buck reaches maturity, he has learned where the bedding pockets are, where the escape routes are, where he can feed with the least exposure, where the wind protects him, and where human danger usually comes from. Research on mule deer movement has shown that they rely heavily on spatial memory and familiar seasonal ranges. In our own informal research, we have found the same mature buck under the same rock from season to season to season. We had a friend from Pennsylvania come out several years ago, and we were hunting big country. We were actually hunting elk, and he bumped a big mature mule deer in one particular clearing, extremely high, very far away from people. And it was under one particular distinct rock that you just couldn't forget after you'd been in that clearing one time. And so he put in for mule deer the next couple of years, finally drew it on the third year, went to that exact spot and killed that tank of an old, mature buck. It happens over and over again. They choose the same country season after season, a lot of times, those big old wily smart guys. What does that mean in hunting terms? Why does that matter? It means a mature buck is not simply reacting to every condition like it's brand new. He has a map in his head already built for survival. He knows where he wants to be. That buck might reuse the same type of bed. He might return to the same security pocket year after year if he survives. He might know how to leave a basin without crossing the obvious saddle every hunter watches. He may let hunters walk past and stay extremely tight because he has already survived that exact kind of pressure before. We've walked extremely close to deer and watched them hang out in their bed and hold tight. So that's where random hunting gets exposed. When the hunter's guessing, bouncing around, and reacting emotionally, he's competing against an animal that understands that country at a much deeper level. You're not hunting a mule deer that is wandering. You're hunting a mule deer that knows the escape routes better than you know the access trail. And bedding is where mature mule deer become the hardest to detect because a mature buck usually doesn't bed randomly. He beds where advantages all stack together in his favor. He wants wind or thermal advantage. He wants a visual advantage. He wants something behind him or above him that protects his back and breaks up his outline. He wants an escape route that lets him leave without exposing himself. He wants low human traffic. He wants to be close enough to feed that he doesn't have to waste energy, but far enough from exposure that he doesn't have to gamble with daylight movement. In high country summer and early season hunts, that might be shade, rock, wind, and broken terrain near good feed. During rifle season, that might be thicker pockets, rougher side hills, timbered cuts, or lower visibility benches where humans can't easily pick him apart. In late season, that may shift again as he balances feed and sun exposure and thermal comfort and escape terrain. That's why mature bucks can feel invisible. They're not just laying down anywhere. They're bedding in places that give them layers of protection depending on the season. The bed is not random. It's the place where a buck can rest, monitor danger, and survive the hunter who's moving too fast. So a lot of hunters assume that if they're not seeing mature bucks, they must go further, higher, deeper, into rougher country. And sometimes that's absolutely true. But just as often, I've found the buck is not further away. He's just living in a different layer of the same country. He might be below the glassing knob instead of across the basin. He might be in the brush finger between two open feeding areas. He might be bedded on a shaded bench underneath visible deer activity. He might be on the backside of a ridge that hunters skyline every morning. He might be tucked into that overlook transition cover between feed and bedding, or close to access in a spot where everybody walks by because they assume no mature buck would live that close. Remote country doesn't automatically equal mature buck country. Distance can help, but security matters more than mileage. So a mature buck wants low disturbance. He wants broken visibility. He wants wind advantage and escape terrain in a place where hunters are unlikely to slow down. That's why those deer feel invisible. They're often not where hunters expect them to be. So anywhere that gives him those things could be a viable option. Invisible does not always mean far away. Sometimes it means close enough that your assumptions walked right past him, right? Now, part of the reason mature mule deer feel invisible has nothing to do with the deer, and it has to do with how hunters actually look at the country. Most deer hunters glass too fast. They look for a whole deer standing in the open instead of pieces of deer hidden inside the landscape. How do I know? I've been with a lot of guys over the years, so I can see what they're looking for and how we need to reframe that. Because a lot of times those guys focus on movement instead of shape, or they skip shadows, or they glance over brush pockets. They only study the prettiest country. And once they see does or small bucks, they're, attracted by the shiny object and they mentally decide they have already figured the basin out. And I believe that's a mistake. A mature buck might not give you a full body view. He might give you an antler tip, an ear, face patch, a rump patch, a leg, a horizontal back line, or one small break in the shadow that doesn't look quite natural. If you're glassing for obvious deer, you're going to miss all those. This is where discipline really matters, right? Glass in grids, reglass the same pockets as light changes. Study cover edges like a puzzle, not just a whole picture. Slow down when the terrain feels right. A mature buck doesn't need to fool your eyes if he can fool your patience first. The way you start making invisible bucks visible is by changing the order of your thinking. So don't start by asking, where are the deer? Start by asking, where should mature buck security exist in this country? Where should mature buck security exist in this country. That means looking beyond feed and tracks and obvious glassing slopes. You want to be looking for places where security stacks together, like broken visibility, places with wind advantage, escape terrain, low pressure areas, transition cover, bedding that's close enough to feed that a buck doesn't have to expose himself for very long. Then glass the country that breaks visibility, not just the open feed. Study the brush fingers, the shaded benches, the broken side hills, the timber cuts, and small rolls where a buck can hide in plain sight. Watch those transition routes we've talked about between feed and bedding during the tightest movement windows, especially early, late, and when conditions shift. Before you move, I want you to account for pressure as well. Ask where hunters are coming from, where roads and trails influence deer behavior, and where a buck would go to avoid that pressure without leaving the area completely. Reglass high probability pockets when light, wind, temperature, or pressure changes. Don't judge a basin too quickly. The goal here is not to cover more country blindly. The goal is to eliminate the wrong country and then slow down when the right security pieces all stack together. Pure mule deer bucks are not ghosts. They are filters. They expose the weak points in a hunter's system. They expose poor glassing. They expose lazy terrain reading. They expose bad timing. They expose over resilience on obvious sign. They expose the difference between a hunter who's simply covering country and a hunter who's actually understanding what the country is saying. That's why these bucks feel invisible. They've learned how to survive the gaps a lot of hunters overlook. They don't have to live in impossible country. They only have to live in secure country. They only have to move during narrow windows. They only have to use wind, terrain, cover, pressure, and patience better than the hunter does. And that's the challenge. If you want to find mature mule deer bucks more consistently, you have to slow down, read the country deeper, and stop assuming empty country is actually empty. Mature mule deer bucks are not invisible because they're magic. They are invisible because they live in the most details a lot of hunters never slow down long enough to see. Now, if you want to go deeper into mule deer movement, pressure patterns, terrain positioning, and structured decision making, that is exactly why I built a mule deer hunting series of ebooks. It's a progressive system designed to help you understand how mule deer actually use country and then how to position yourself accordingly. I have a link to those ebooks in the description. And if you want ongoing access to the Team Backbone community, classroom, my full digital vault of mule deer resources, private discussions, and direct communication to me for planning, you can join Team Backbone at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Everything we talk about here is connected. Preparation is not a single video, it's a system. Thanks for being here. I appreciate all of you. Please hit me up with questions and comments. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.